Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we're really delighted, really excited to be hosting journalist David Von Drehle this evening. He's here to talk about his new book, The Book of Charlie: Wisdom from the Remarkable American Life of a 109-year-old man. This is, plain and simple, a wonderful book, which actually has its roots in a chance meeting. David moved to Kansas City 16 years ago and happened to end up across the street from Dr. Charlie White, who then was a mere 102 years old. And Charlie lived another 7 years. He was quite an engaging teller of tales, and David, who's quite a skilled listener, recognized a great book in the long arc of Charlie's life. Not only were Charlie's own experiences and adventures, which you're going to hear about, of course, in a minute, not only were they interesting and instructive in their own right, but the fact that they spanned more than a century through a period of incredible change, invention, and disruption in America at large, led David to reflect on both one man's life and 100 plus years of American history. Further, Charlie himself was a paragon of resilience and equanimity, someone who held fast to some simple truths, which made him a natural role model. And as David explains at the start of the book, he wrote it with his own 4 kids in mind, hoping that they take some lessons from Charlie's life and incredible attitude. And there's certainly much for the rest of us, too, in this inspirational, lovingly crafted tale about an exemplary individual. Anyone who's followed David's own work over the years knows he's a gifted chronicler and can write the heck out of many subjects. He and I first met at the Washington Post, where he arrived in 1991 after stints at the Denver Post and the Miami Herald. He reported and edited at the Washington Post for about a decade and a half, and then moved to Time Magazine to serve as editor at large. After a decade there, he returned to the Post as a columnist. His previous 4 books, like his journalism, dealt with a broad range of topics, including Abraham Lincoln, capital punishment, the ballot recount in Florida in the 2000 presidential election, and a fire in New York City in 1911 that altered the history of the labor movement in the United States. And speaking of accomplished journalists and talented book writers, we have another one here this evening, Rick Atkinson, who will be moderating. A 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner, Rick, like David, once worked at the Washington Post, where over more than 2 decades, he did stints as a reporter, foreign correspondent, and editor. Along the way, he also pursued a lifelong interest in military affairs and military history. And that has led to a virtual shelf full of acclaimed books about the West Point class of 1966, the Persian Gulf War, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, a World War II trilogy, and the first volume of what will be another trilogy, this one, A Military History of the American Revolution, and Rick is currently hard at work on volume 2. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David Von Drehle and Rick Atkinson.
Thank you. It is a privilege to be here again at my old hometown bookstore. Those kids that Bradley mentioned first chose their first picture books downstairs and hid in the little nook, and we grew up at Politics and Prose, and it's lovely to be back here among so many friends.
It is, and thanks for coming out to hear us talk about what is really a terrific book. And it's off to a great start. I heard it was in the top 10 on Amazon this week. It was published on Tuesday, and it is a wonderful tale about a very improbable subject. So I should confess, first of all, we've been friends for a long time, three of us actually, and there are others in the room who are from that same Washington Post crowd. So let's begin at the beginnings. It's 2007. You and Karen decide you're going to give up the house on Reno Road, take the 4 kids, and move to Kansas City. Not only Kansas City, but to the lovely suburb on the Kansas side of Kansas City, Mission Hills. Why?
Well, for Karen, it was traumatic because she said she'd spent the first 18 years of her life trying to get out of Kansas City, and now she was back. For me, it was a new adventure. But we had become a 4-kid, 1 newspaperman family in what was becoming the most expensive city on the face of the earth, or one of them. And so our math didn't entirely add up going forward, and we were realizing that we would probably need to live in the suburbs somewhere. And as much as we loved this neighborhood, we weren't charmed by the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Tough place to raise 4 kids who are all basically the same age. And I see Brendan and Michelle, whose kids are exactly the same age as ours, and God, the experiences we shared. Anyway, so we were going to the suburbs somewhere, and Time Magazine called at just that moment and said, come to work for us, and we don't care where you live. And I realized that I could make more money in a less expensive place, and that's what happened. I fell in love with Kansas City, I have to admit. I had 25 years on the East Coast. It was a dream. I loved every minute of it. But I realized once I got there that I really am a kind of middle-of-the-country guy.
You're from Colorado.
I'm from Colorado. I don't naturally, even though I write a opinion column in the Washington Post, arguing doesn't come naturally to me, or at least not anymore in my life. I explained to civilians out in the middle of the country that in every city and town of America, there are brilliant people who are really good at arguing with each other. And many of them figure out that you can make a really good living doing that in Washington, D.C. And they come here and they have great arguments during the day, but sometimes they carry over into the PTA or the grocery store line or the parking lot. Karen was remembering fondly the other day a time that she came to an intersection, you know, where you both get there at the same time and you go, no, you go, and then it's no, you go, and you start, and finally one person goes. And as the person drives through the intersection, she gets flipped off. And that really is different out in the middle of the country. I once nodded off at a traffic light, and it changed from red to green. I wasn't paying attention. I looked up as it was changing back to red, so it had gone through the entire cycle, and there were 2 cars behind me. They hadn't honked or done anything. They're just like, I guess he doesn't want to go.
So in August 2007, you've just arrived in Mission Hills, Kansas. Brad alluded to this. You go out to pick up the Sunday newspaper. You look across the street, and there is a 102-year-old man washing his girlfriend's car. And this is Charlie White.
Bare-chested, in an old pair of cut-off swim trunks, muscular chest. He's got the hose in one hand and the sponge going on the car with the other. It's, wavy hair over one eye, waves to me across the street. I noticed that the car is exactly where his girlfriend had left it the night before. So I put two and two together, and I realized he's been over there all night with her, and now he feels so good about how things are going that he's washing her car before she wakes up. And I said, this is a person I need to know.
And you get to know him. He lives to 109. That's not a spoiler, it's a subtitle.
Well, you don't think when you meet a 102-year-old person that you're starting a long friendship, but we did in this case.
So before we dive into Charlie's eventful life, that life spans from the horse and buggy era to the era of spaceflight and microchips and artificial intelligence and all the rest of it. And you write that this is a book about surviving, even thriving through adversity and revolutionary change. You're looking, as you write, to pass on tools for resilience and equanimity. Presumably, you presume that even the Luddites among us can adapt those tools to our lives. How does that play out in Charlie, and how do you try to use him as your prism for this effort?
Well, as Brad alluded to, my kids, when they were young, I'd read to them every night before they were going to bed. Somebody asked me, why didn't you just, I'd sit on the floor of the hallway with the lights out and use a flashlight. And they're like, why didn't you just read on the couch? I said, because they were in bed. The whole point was to get them in bed. And once they figured out what I did for a living, they started saying, well, why don't you write a book for us? And it turns out, at least for me, writing a children's novel is a lot harder than you think it's going to be, and never worked out. But what I realized was that they are going to have this life of tremendous change, unpredictability, disruption, and that it's causing young people a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, and that they needed a guide to deal with that, and I was not the right person to be that guide, because a lot of gadgets have changed in my lifetime, but the real structure of society has not changed that much. I mean, my parents had radio, I had radio, now my kids have Spotify. It's all, listening to music out of something, a box. Needed to go back one more generation to the beginning of the 20th century, when there were 8,000 cars in all of America. Most people were getting around by horse and buggy or by walking. 6% of Americans graduated from high school in 1900, let alone college. There were no antibiotics, no real cures for any diseases. Diarrhea was a leading cause of death in America when Charlie was born. And on, no footprint, on the South Pole or the North Pole. He winds up seeing footprints on the moon, rover tracks on Mars. He goes from before radio to use an iPhone before he dies. He had seen the world change. He had lived through a worldwide pandemic, just like the one that messed up my kids' lives. He had survived 2 world wars, You just go down the list. He had to reinvent his job halfway through his career, just like journalists have had to do, and so many other careers have had to do and are going to have to do in coming years. Charlie was educated as a general practitioner doctor, a guy who carried all his tools around in a bag and made house calls, and really couldn't treat many diseases. He could set bones, he could lance of boil. He could deliver a baby, but if you were dying of pneumonia, and you were probably gonna die. And so he was part wellness coach, part grief counselor. That was the job he was trained for. Well, that job was eliminated in the middle of the 20th century. It was destroyed. Suddenly there were cures. Suddenly there were treatments. And the future of medicine then was going to be specialists who could do something actually to help people other than coach them through a disease. So he had to figure out a way to get retrained as a specialist. Had a whole second career as the first anesthesiologist in Kansas City. So all these things I realized as I looked at it were relevant to my kids, to say that you're not the only people who've ever gone through disruption, change, uncertainty.
So he leads a charmed life, disrupted by some hard knocks. And the first really hard knock is in 1914 with his father, who has the unusual career combination of being a preacher and an insurance salesman. Tell us about what happens to Dad White.
So Charlie moved to Kansas City when he was 5 years old, so that his preacher dad could take this second job and support what had become a family of 5 kids. And it was a Monday morning in May 1914, and Dad goes off to work in a high-rise, one of the brand new high-rises created by the new technology of the electric passenger elevator. 12-story building. Dad's office is on the 9th floor. 10:15 or so, he decides he's going to go down the street to the city market and collect a premium from a client, and gets his hat and his pipe and steps out into the hallway. And there's the elevator, the door's open, there's the usual operators not at the controls. There's a substitute, and as Dad's stepping onto the elevator, the guy accidentally puts it in motion and it starts rising, and instead of Dad stepping onto the elevator, he steps into the shaft, and his body is on the floor. So he's rising now with his legs dangling, his body's on the floor of the car, smashes into the top of the door frame, crushed up there. Now the elevator operator is panicked, obviously, so he throws it in reverse, and as soon as it drops, then his whole body slips down, follows his feet into the elevator shaft, and he drops 9 stories to his death. Couldn't have taken more than a second and a half or something. And the whole world changed, for Charlie's mom. Suddenly she's widowed with 5 kids, no job, no income. It was a complete, just devastation.
How old is he at that point?
8 years old.
So 8 years old, his world changes utterly. Life becomes quite hard for the family. You write that being treated as a survivor helped him to survive. And this is lesson number 1 in his life, really. He's on his way, as you write quite vividly, fundamentally to embracing Stoicism. Talk about Stoicism. Tell us about Stoicism as seen through the life of this unusual man.
Stoicism, it's a philosophy that I've been wrestling with all my adult life, learning it, forgetting it, trying to relearn it. It's got a bad rap. It's used as an adjective to describe lack of feeling. Reviewer in the Wall Street Journal referred to it as a very dour philosophy. That's not it at all, at least as I understand it. I believe it's a philosophy of freedom, of joy.
We trace it to the Romans, basically.
Basically, back to the Romans. And interestingly, to Romans both at the very top of society, the most privileged.
Marcus Aurelius.
The Emperor of Rome, Seneca, the famous playwright and teacher of Nero, all the way down to the lowest, the slave Epictetus is one of the great Stoic philosophers, my favorite. And the thing that they're seeing, both at the top and the bottom of society, is that much of our lives is completely out of our control. What's out of our control? Everything outside of ourselves. The government, other people, our health, our fate, whether we fall down an elevator shaft instead of going out the building. All these things happen to us. To worry and to be upset and to allow your life to be controlled by something that you have no influence over is a recipe for unhappiness. But we do control ourselves, everything of our own will. So we get to choose and can choose our purpose, our ambitions, what we try to accomplish, what we decide to make important in our lives, what we're going to value. All of that's in our control. And what people have asked me, do you think Charlie would be surprised that a book was written about him in the neighborhood? And I say, I think he'd be not surprised that somebody wrote down his stories, because he knew there were some good stories in there. He loved telling them. He'd be very surprised that he's been yanked into a philosophy book, because he didn't feel like he really had a philosophy. He would say, well, his mother always told him, do the right thing, which is, but if you think about it, that's not a bad philosophy, as opposed to the alternative, do the wrong thing, or do the stupid thing, or do the pointless thing, or all the other choices. Do the right thing is not a bad philosophy. And that's what Stoicism frees you to try to focus on, that you don't control the past, it's gone. You don't know what's coming in the future, it's not here. What you have is this moment, every moment, when you have the option to make a good decision, a good choice, the right thing.
You quote Marcus Aurelius, "Love the hand that fate deals you and play it as your own." And he also says, "Remember how ephemeral all mortal things are." That's easy for him to say. He's an emperor.
Yeah, but
that's Charlie too.
Yeah, that's Charlie, and that's Epictetus as well, who was a slave and who, remember, what was ephemeral was the fact that he was owned and that he was under another person's control. And what I say is that Epictetus understood that another person could decide, what his work was going to be, whether he was bought or sold, but couldn't decide what kind of person Epictetus was going to be, what he was going to value, what he was going to stand for. That was not in anyone's control but his own. So it's liberating for the slave as well as for the emperor.
Let's talk a bit about the highlights and a couple of the lowlights in his life. He goes to Mizzou, University of Missouri, and then he talks his way.
Somewhere Karen, my wife, is cheering right now.
Go Tigers. And then he talks his way into Northwestern Medical School. He's rejected, goes to Chicago, to Evanston, basically says, "You've made a mistake."
You've made a terrible mistake.
And the dean says, "Well, I can see your point." He, among other things, he teaches himself to play the saxophone by listening to jazz on the radio.
Which had just been invented. Yeah, so if his timing had been even a little different, I don't know how he would have worked his way through college. He would have found something. But, and admittedly, his family was musically talented. So I'm not suggesting this for everybody, but yeah, he listened to the Crystal radio set in the first 2 years of radio in America. There was a band from Kansas City called the Coon Sanders Orchestra, Joe Coon and Carlton Sanders, and they played pretty tame white version of jazz. Kansas City, like most places, in the 1920s was very segregated, and there were some fantastic musicians in Kansas City in those days, but they were black. They were, Benny Moten's Kansas City Orchestra, which
Basie,
Count
Charlie
Basie,
Parker,
yeah,
Big Mama Thornton. It's a long list.
but they weren't on the radio.
No.
This other band was, they were popular from coast to coast in the early 1920s. They were known as the band that made radio famous. And Charlie listened to them on his crystal radio set with a secondhand saxophone that he had bought, because he figured out that these guys were so popular, kids were going to start having a lot of dances, and they would need to hire cover bands. And so there was business to be done if you knew these tunes. And so he taught them to himself and worked his way through college and med school on the bandstand.
And that kind of adaptability is one of the hallmarks, certainly, of his career. So you mentioned he becomes a general practice physician. He works in Kansas City, and then World War II comes along. He goes into the Army as an Army doctor. He eventually is a lieutenant colonel, and he has to reinvent himself there. Anesthesiology, as you describe it, then was a specialty for failed GPs.
Exactly, yeah. Somebody gave Harvard an endowment for a chair in anesthesiology in the 1930s, and they deliberately didn't use it for anesthesiology. It was too low. They gave it to a doctor in internal medicine because a place like the Harvard Medical School wouldn't teach something as undignified as anesthesiology. I guess it was noble to be in screaming pain while your organs were being operated on. I don't quite get the reasoning, but that was the standard. And the interesting thing about Charlie in medicine, even though he was a doctor his whole life and felt blessed, would talk about how blessed he was to be a doctor. He would say, "There's no other way you can spend your life that puts you in personal contact with people in need so intimately." Felt really honored by it. He did not really believe in going to the doctor. He never took his kids. He didn't really go himself. There's a scene in the book where he's operating on his own foot when there's a medical emergency, and he has to quickly tape himself up and call for a wheelchair to take him to the ER because his foot's numbed up and he can't walk.
He can't give himself ether before he does that, though. But obviously there's a crying need for anesthesiologists in World War II. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of wounded and sick soldiers to take care of, and he converts himself into one of the most prominent anesthesiologists in the Midwest, certainly.
Yeah, so one thing I had not really focused on, you, of course, are the world's living authority on it, the engine of change that World War II was. We think of, the incredible innovations in Silicon Valley. That was nothing compared to what happened between 1942 and 1945. Everything changed. Every industry was revolutionized, and medicine was no different. This mold that Alexander Fleming had discovered that appeared to kill bacteria, and nobody had done anything with this for 15 years, they suddenly realized, oh, yeah, that could really come in handy here in the war. So penicillin is, a creation of World War II.
And they've been making it by the gram, and then they're making it by the kilogram, and then they're making it by the ton.
By the ton. And the same with anesthesiology. They're actually going to try to save these people's lives, which in previous wars had not really been a goal. And they came up with tremendous advances, endotracheal tubes, intravenous anesthesia, partial blockers, so you wouldn't have put people entirely under. All of this came about in about 2 years' time, or a year and a half, and they had to train people to do it. Charlie's insight was put his hand up and say, send me. So he was sent off for 90 days of training. They called them 90-day wonders at the Mayo Clinic. And he served out the war, returned to Kansas City. Now, when he went in, he was ending his career. Because if you're a general practice doctor, especially in the Depression, you're living hand to mouth on the patients that you can attract.
They're paying you in chickens.
They're paying you in chickens and encyclopedias and in nothing. He had struggled to build a practice. Well, he was going to go in the Army, and all those patients were going to go to other doctors. So his expectation was he'd be coming home to no career, starting over at, ground zero. Instead, he sees this opportunity, and he returns to Kansas City as the first Mayo Clinic trained anesthesiologist in the city. And so again, we talk about what are these lessons, half the journalists in America have lost their jobs in the past 10 or 15 years, Lots of store cashiers are going to lose jobs, lots of what's AI going to do to so many, not just working jobs, but it's going to be rough on attorneys, it's going to be rough on accountants. You just go down the line. Here's an example of somebody whose career was wiped out by technology, who said, okay, maybe I'll go with it. Maybe this is an opportunity. Let me walk through a door. And winds up with a much better career than he had before.
Among other dark moments in his life, he's married 3 times. When you're 109, you go through marriages. Talk about his first wife, because this is a sad part of his life.
It was tremendously sad. My theory is that as he left his residency at Kansas City General Hospital, I'm guessing Charlie was not super experienced in romance. He had been advanced several years in school, so he was always the youngest kid in his class during junior high and high school. And then he was playing on the bandstand at every dance he ever went to. He wasn't doing the dancing. He fell in love with a teenage girl from Joplin, Missouri, who had come to the big city to work in the hospital, and they got married right after he finished his residency. Mildred Crystal. She was beautiful. Charlie loved beautiful women, and they loved him. But being the young wife in arguably the most depraved and decadent city in America, before there was Las Vegas, there was Kansas City, long days alone because he's out on house calls all night long. He's struggling to start his career. She became an addict, alcoholic, and probably a drug addict as well. And that shadowed their entire lives together for the nearly 20 years that they were married.
And she has a bad end.
She came to a bad end. I don't want to give away everything. You got to buy the book to find out how Mildred does.
Yeah, it's worth buying the book just to read about the bad end. So you write about iterative and incremental development, which makes no sense to me. Could you explain it?
Yeah. So they have this terminology in Silicon Valley, IID, iterative and incremental development. And the idea is that if you're working on a problem, you don't try to go immediately to the perfect solution of the problem because you're unlikely to get there. What you need to do is find the first step toward the solution to the problem. Take that step. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but it's incremental. And you then learn from the step you took to take the next step. That's the iterative part. So IID. I think Charlie understood this long before there was a Silicon Valley. And the example I give is when he helped to pioneer open heart surgery in the Midwest. So another of these innovations in World War II was the idea that you could perform surgery on a human heart. Prior to that, the idea was that it's kind of, inviolate and you can't cut into it. But a surgeon from Iowa, Dwight Harkin, said, these guys are coming in here with shrapnel in their hearts. It's a death sentence. So since they're going to die anyway, why don't we try to save their lives? And develops this technique to open the chest, quickly make a little finger-sized hole in the wall of the heart so you can poke your finger in there and feel around, get the shrapnel and pull it out, sew them back up. And he saves, 125 lives this way. It works great. The idea after the war is this could be used in other ways, and particularly for a condition called mitral valve stenosis, where your mitral valve kind of closes and there's an adhesion of flesh and it gets too narrow and it can cause blood clots and it can cause heart failure, ultimately can kill you. It's usually a result of rheumatic fever in a young person. Hey, we could do this thing, cut this little cut, reach in, pull the valve back open again, and solve the problem, stitch them up, same technique. There was one problem that it would take enough time if the blood was flowing normally that they'd probably bleed out in the process. So what's the answer? Charlie reads about research that has discovered that you can put a patient under anesthesia, and if you can figure out how to cool them down, the blood will slow down the colder their body temperature gets. And when the blood thickens and isn't flowing as well, then you're buying time to perform this surgery. Okay, so now how do I get a body cold? By this time he's successful enough, he's bought a little plot of land and he has a couple of horses out there. He loves horseback riding. And he's out there feeding the horses and notices the big water trough on his farm. He called it a horse tank. And he said, that's about the right size to put a person in there and cover him up with ice and you chill him down. So he buys a new horse tank. They take it into the operating room with a bunch of bags of ice and put the guy under, drop him in, cover him with ice, cool him down to 84 degrees or so, pull him out, operate him, goes perfectly. And for the next 2-3 years in Kansas City until the perfection of the heart-lung machine, Charlie's horse tank is the cutting edge of cardiac surgery in the Midwest. That's iterative, incremental design. He wasn't waiting around for a perfect solution. He found a solution and tried it, and it didn't last forever, but it worked for a little while.
If you have questions or comments for David, please feel free to come up to the microphone here and we'll take those questions and comments in a minute. Let's go back to Stoicism. You quote Seneca, "Let's postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books every day." You quote Emerson, "Live in the present, above time." Is this Charlie's life? Is this what Charlie's doing?
Absolutely. There's a scene that I described early on. his youngest daughter lived next door to us with her then husband to keep an eye on Charlie across the street, although I never really saw the need for it. And she told this story about some neighborhood spat that had come up, you know, the kind of thing where this person says this thing and that person, and like, can you believe what they said? And finally comes around to a phone call, and Madeline's on the phone getting yelled at about something, and Charlie's sitting at the table watching this transpire, and finally the call ends and she's fuming, and he says, "You've got to let that go." He says, "I don't pay any attention to people like that. You know, life's too short. That'll kill you, you know." Moving just above time, you can't control people like that, so you can't give them authority over your emotions. You can't go back, even if you can't undo whatever led to the conversation. You can't replay time to have the conversation go differently. You know, it doesn't mean that you ignore things. You're constantly trying to learn and improve yourself. It's letting go of this idea that you're controlling anything beyond yourself.
He didn't think that he lived to 109 because he was virtuous.
No. He, of course, somebody lives that old, they're getting the question multiple times a day, what's the secret to a long life? What's the secret to longevity? And Charlie was wonderful because he always said luck. It's just luck. He said it, my genome has never betrayed me. You know, I've never gotten a life-shortening disease. You know, one of his stepdaughters at age 66 died of cancer the week before Charlie turned 102. You know, Linda had lung and breast cancer. She'd never smoked in her life. Charlie smoked like a chimney most of his life. You know, it's nothing fair about it. There's nothing. So he wouldn't. He was very honest about that, and he knew that he'd gotten lucky because he'd never stepped into an elevator shaft or all the other things that can shorten a life. And none of the in all the gangland shootings that he witnessed on the streets of Chicago and Kansas City, none of the bullets, you know, hit him. So all these things had happened. You don't learn anything about how to live a long time in this book, but it's about the depth of life, not the length.
Let's go back to wife number 2 for a minute. Your adorable wife, Karen Ball, was a very fine reporter and helped you in a couple of significant occasions here, and included trying to find out more about Jean, the second wife, the P-51 pilot.
Well, we didn't even know she was a P-51 pilot. So Charlie had this story about his second wife, and he said, yeah, she was a great girl, and we were only married for a little while, and she was a lady gym teacher, and she ran off with some other lady gym teacher and took my golf clubs, and it was all fine, and you know.
In his convertible.
In his convertible.
Yeah.
And that was all anybody knew, you know, about his second wife, and it's a hell of a good story. But Karen, my wife, just a terrific reporter, was not satisfied with that, and she started digging, and digging and digging and digging, and one clue led to another, and one discovery led to another, until one day I walked in after having met somebody for lunch, and she looked at me and she said, "You'll never guess who I just was on the phone with for the past 90 minutes. Turned out Jean was alive and well at age 101, I think, herself, in Southern California, and Karen had found her, and they'd had a lovely conversation about her brief marriage to Charlie White. And it didn't go exactly the way Charlie had described it. she was a fantastic person. I wish Charlie was damaged goods. They got married on the rebound from Mildred's death, and he was not in a good place to be with another person. And
especially that person.
yeah, a person who was fantastic. So in, again, World War II, all the pilots, male pilots in America, were needed flying bombers and fighter pilots in the European and Pacific theaters. So you had planes rolling off factory lines constantly and needing to go to shipping destinations on the coast. And so the Women's Air Corps was created, where women were trained and allowed to fly these planes around. And Jean Landis was the star of the Women's Air Corps in every way. There's a photograph of her in her flight suit on the wing of a P-51 Mustang, and she is knockout, just fantastic. And she flew these planes back and forth across the country. It's a wonderful scene. She's coming in for a landing at a little airstrip somewhere in the middle of the country, and she asks for permission to land. And at the same time, a male pilot comes on the radio and says, "Holy cow, there's one of those brand new P-51 Mustangs up here. This thing's incredible." And Jean comes back on the radio, "May I please land?" And the guy's like, "Lady, get out of the way. There's a P-51 coming in." She says, "I am the P-51.
So talk about the writing life for a minute. Brad had alluded to the fact you've written several really fine books, including an extraordinary portrait of Lincoln in 1862 and the definitive book of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, which changed labor law and workplace safety forever. Those are big public events. This is microcosm. This is meditative. As a writer, how do you shift gears? How do you tackle Charlie when it's quite a different task than you'd set for yourself in earlier books?
That is an excellent question, and one that I probably should have thought about before I tried it.
I sent it to you.
No, I mean, I should have thought about it 8 years ago, is what I mean. Because it turned out to be a lot harder than I thought. I thought writing a little book about an interesting old man would be kind of a layup, but it was a struggle to find the speed to go at and the level of detail that would be right. And so the book is much shorter than anything I've ever written before. And it felt like, let's be honest, Charlie didn't split the atom. He didn't cure cancer. He didn't walk on the moon. He was an interesting guy. And I was thrilled and honored to know him. But this, my Lincoln book is probably 350 pages, 110, 120,000 words. This wasn't worth 120,000 words, and it would have been deadly to do it at that length. And so to learn how to tell these stories really quickly, my goal, and I'll be honest about this, my goal was that no reader would ever pause long enough to say, "Why am I reading a book about a doctor in Kansas City?"
Nobody is going to ask that question of himself. I can assure you of that. Well, the decisions you made work beautifully, actually.
Thank you.
The tempo and, I mean, trying to get inside him. You come into his life, obviously late in his life, and you know him for 7 years, but he's declining by the time he's 108 or so.
Yeah, starts to lose a step.
And so it's hard. Yeah, right. May we all be so lucky. But the reconstructive challenges here were substantial.
One of the things that was a real blessing is that Charlie, while he was a great raconteur and loved to tell the stories, with the exception of the tale about Gene Landis and the golf clubs, he was scrupulously accurate. We would keep checking things out to the extent that we could, and they always checked out, which made things much easier. Mm-hmm. I went over one time, he was 106 years old. I got this idea in my head that I would try to write an essay. It never got done, but the idea was, so I grew up on Saturday morning cartoons, and the cartoons in the movie theater that would play before the movies. I loved cartoons. And I figured out one day that every cartoon I grew up on could be traced through a family tree of artists to a studio that Walt Disney operated for a year in Kansas City when he was 21, 22 years old. Some of the guys stayed with him through all the Disney cartoons. Other guys broke off and became the Warner Brothers Cartoon Factory, which then spun off the Hanna-Barbera empire, all of it, from the Jetsons to Snow White. And so I thought that could be a good story about creativity and nexus of genius and that kind of thing. I went over to Charlie and said, I'd like to talk to you about Kansas City in 1921. He didn't know Walt Disney, but they walked the same streets. His home was maybe 6 blocks from Disney's studio. Charlie at 106 was correcting the details of the story, I would say. So they showed his cartoons at the Newman Theater. That was at 10th and Walnut. He said, no, that was at 11th and Walnut. And I go back and find out, yeah, he was right, and Neil Gabler or whoever had written the book on Walt Disney had the wrong address, but Charlie knew it. So you ask, how do you reconstruct it? It really helped that he told it straight. And he loved, almost as much as he loved telling the stories of his exploits, he loved talking about his mistakes. He thought that was a hoot, too. He left the Army in 1945, and some of his buddies that he had served with in Utah area, and they'd all gone skiing on weekends together, they said, hey, you should invest in this ski resort that we're going to start. It's going to be in a place called Aspen, Colorado. And he said, that's a ghost town, Didn't invest in Aspen, Colorado. Didn't invest in the company that was started in Kansas City basement of Ewing Kauffman that became a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical firm. He was like, that's crazy. He's grinding up oyster shells in his basement to make antacid powder. Nothing's going to come of that. And he took as much joy talking about the mistakes he made as the successes, because can you hear me in back? He understood it was all a part of life. It was
Adaptability.
Yeah, it was all iterative and incremental microphones. The mistakes are a part of the life. You couldn't have the life without the mistakes. And that's a Stoic position as well. That's a freeing realization to let yourself make mistakes and understand that that's a part of who we are. That's a part of how we get to where we end up. And it doesn't mean we're proud of them. It doesn't mean we don't, but it's all a story. And ultimately, as a storyteller, the light bulb that went on for me in listening to Charlie was that we make our lives, in a sense, out of how we choose to tell our stories? Are these mistakes, irretrievable setbacks, or were they windows that opened when a door closed?
Are you shackled by?
Are you shackled by an event, or are you, do you grow from it? And that this narration is one of those Stoic choices that we're able to make. We're able to tell our own story either in a minor key or a major key. And that narration in a way makes the reality, makes the truth.
We should mention, but we're going to make them buy the book to find the full story. He decides when he's 16, I think, in 1921, that he's going to take a road trip, right? And the road trip is to California from Kansas City.
There was just one problem. There were no roads from Kansas City to California in 1921. So he set off in the company of an older 18-year-old boy and his fellow, there were two 16-year-olds who graduated in that class from Westport High School, Charlie White and a guy called Edgar Snow, who some of you may recognize that name. He was, for much of the 20th century, the most famous foreign correspondent in the world, Edgar Snow. He was Charlie's best friend in high school. And the three of them went across America. This was Charlie's favorite story. He loved reliving the trek. It was his personal declaration of independence. And all they had was a guidebook that would say things like, follow the wagon tracks 10 miles to the hemlock tree and turn right. And in this way, they pieced their way across Kansas and Colorado and then through the Raton Pass over New Mexico and Arizona. This is at a time, New Mexico and Arizona had been states for about 10 years. They're literally driving at this point just across the desert. And
in a Model T.
In a Model T. Slightly more complicated than a riding lawnmower, but not much. And they made it. They made it to Los Angeles, which was nothing but a few houses and a lot of orange groves. Los Angeles, when they got there, was about the size of Omaha, Nebraska today. The older guy had enough money to take the train back. That left Edgar and Charlie alone in Los Angeles with no way to get home. So they started hopping freight trains at age 16 in the middle of the biggest railroad strike in American history. So the rails were crawling with detectives to prevent, Union sabotage of the trains. And they're getting hauled off these trains, left in deserts alone, crawling back on. They rode for over 100 miles on the cowcatcher of a steam locomotive. If you remember, that pointy thing on the front, clinging to the cowcatcher because they figured out that the engineer can't see the cowcatcher from that angle. So they're clinging to it. They strapped themselves with their belts to the cowcatcher. But it was all a lark.
It made him the man he became.
Made him the man he became. He had this wonderful description of riding a flat car of the Missouri Pacific Railroad out of the Rocky Mountains through the Royal Gorge near Canyon City, this tight 10-mile canyon on the Arkansas River, winding back and forth, the two of them, looking up at the sky between the canyon walls and saying, "This is the life."
We'll end it there. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, David, for writing a really great book.
Thank you, Rick.